Welcome back. We will take just 1 minute more while we slowly reconvene. We know it's always difficult to get back from the coffee break, above all when there are so many people to interact with. But please slowly reconvene to the plenary. So welcome back, everyone. We hope you had a nice coffee break. I hope that also the online participants were able to take some coffee, to take some time and interact through the app. Right now, we will continue with our program and the next plenary panel. This panel, mapping the field of participation, the progress, challenges, and possible ways forward, is dedicated to presenting 4 input papers, which we hope you have had the chance to read. They were circulated before the event and are still among the resources on the online platform, so you can always access those input papers there. We will have the opportunity right now to hear short presentations to these input papers and listen from experts who are joining us today. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session, Hanna Siarova, Research Director, Public Policy and Management Institute, who will introduce the panel participants and lead this conversation in the next 90 minutes. So Hanna Siarova will connect online. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Eleni. I hope everyone can hear me. I can hear that probably, yes. Dear participants, welcome to the second plenary session of today. This session will also take place in a hybrid format. Some of the speakers, including myself, are joining you virtually, but nevertheless, it is still great that regarding of all the travel difficulties, we are still able to join and connect together for this dialogue, and be patient if there are some technical difficulties arising, but I guess over the past 2 years we became quite tolerant to those, so I think it all will go well. My name is Hanna, and I'm happy to be your moderator for this session. I'm actually connecting to you from Vilnius, Lithuania, which is now experiencing the very same humanitarian crisis as Rabbi Michael Shudrich described, just on Lithuanian-Belarusian border. And I'm connecting from the context of very inconsistent responses to the border crisis coming from various actors, but which sometimes forget about the priority of human rights when reacting to the crisis and when designing the responses. On the other hand, as a Belarusian myself, I'm also coming from the context where many grassroots organizations face all the possible barriers one can imagine in their activities, but which are still against the odds, are trying to keep civil society alive and support the vulnerable migrant families who have happened to get stuck in the unfortunate political game but have no voice whatsoever. And in such a context, which is present across many countries, as we saw and discussed in the first plenary session, the importance of closing the gaps of civic and political participation of migrant and refugee communities is imperative. And even though we have seen quite many promising and inspiring examples at the policy and the grassroots level, we all agree that we still have a long way to go. And in this session, we will look deeper into 4 thematic areas, interventions in which could support refugee and migrant inclusion, focusing specifically on volunteering, participation in political life, access to education, and educational initiatives to countering hate speech, which is the rising phenomenon worldwide. These areas were chosen in the context of the growing complexity of migration flows and the complexity of the dynamics of those in Europe, and also different ways that we can come up with to promote the inclusion of migrants and refugees across the continent, and different roles that both policymakers and grassroots actors, such as faith-based organizations, can take in those specifically. As Eleni mentioned, the KAICIID has prepared 4 discussion papers, which will serve as an input for generating further discussion and feedback for the proposed recommendations and models in the mentioned 4 areas. And also we will try to discuss the key success factors and challenges on the way to implementing those recommendations and models. We will have a number of distinguished speakers in this session who are experts in their respective fields and who will also help us to keep this discussion going. But we also hope for the active participation of all of you, both offline and online. And I would like now to invite the speakers who are present physically in the room to join the stage. I would like to introduce all the participants of this session. Our first we will have 2 presentations. Our 2 presenters are Dr. Majbritt, Lyck Bowen, who is a research fellow at the Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at the University of Winchester, and a program leader for the Master Studies on Reconciliation and Peace Building. And she's also currently managing a research project that focuses on the involvement of religious actors in the integration of migrants. And Dr. Majbritt will be so kind to give us an overview of the key messages from the first 3 input papers, and she will be joining us virtually. The second presenter, Ms. Olivia Quinn, is a humanitarian consultant and head of programs and projects at Code on the Road, a non-profit civil society organization focused on refugee education and inclusion. And Ms. Olivia also worked extensively with humanitarian innovation, refugee education, humanitarian research, and strategy and program development for different organizations in Europe and Middle East and North Africa. And Ms. Olivia is also currently a consultant for KAICIID, researching how education can counter anti-refugee and anti-migrant hate speech in Europe, and will be presenting the case study findings and recommendations stemming from her research. But besides 2 presenters, we will also have 5 commentators who will offer their reflections and reactions to the findings shared by the presenters and give a starting point for discussion of the findings, which will be continued further in the working session later in the day and tomorrow. I would like to introduce our commentators, who are Ms. Rachel Bayani, a representative of the Brussels office of the Bahai International Community. She will be joining us virtually as well. Ms. Laura Batalla Adam, who is an Ashoka's Hello Europe migration policy representative in Brussels, bridging the gap between social entrepreneurship and policymaking in the field of migration and integration. Dr. Andrew Orton, also joining us virtually, is a director of education and associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Durham University, and deputy director of the Center for Social Justice and Community Action, and a fellow in the Durham Research Methods Center. Mr. Alexander Mundt, a senior policy advisor for the Euro Bureau of the United Nations Refugee Agency, who is also prior to joining UNHCR. He served as a head of protection in Afghanistan and as a senior policy analysis at the Center of Competence and on Humanitarian Negotiation. And finally, we also would hear from Dr. Giancarlo Penza, a representative of community of Sant Egidio and a member of Human Rights Commission for the Global Campaign Against the Death Penalty. Please welcome all the speakers and contributors. I would also like to remind our audience joining online and offline that you can submit your questions and reactions via the chat, and they will be raised either right after the presentations or commentators' interventions or at some point during the discussion. And now, without further ado, I would like to give floor to our first presenter, Dr. Majbritt Lyck Bowen. Please, Majbritt.
Thank you. Can I get my PowerPoint presentation up and running, please? Thank you. Brilliant. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for having me here today. And I'm really sorry I can't join you in person, but unfortunately the COVID situation in the UK is still quite serious. So I'm here to talk about the 3 different input papers that I have written. So the first one is on increasing and strengthening the participation of migrants and refugees in volunteering in their local communities. The second one is on improving the engagement of migrant and refugee-led organizations in public policy-making processes in Europe. And the last one is on making sure that migrant and refugee children can go to school. Now, we have chosen these 3 different areas because they are all very important for integration. So I'm just going to quickly go into why these are important. I'm going to focus on volunteering, and for the others, you can read about the importance of them in the input papers themselves. But basically, looking at volunteering is important at many different levels. So at the personal level for the migrant and refugees themselves, they will gain new skills and experiences and contacts, which can help them, which research has shown can help them gain employment or gain further education. They also build a network of new friends. So by volunteering, they can meet people from their own culture, but perhaps more importantly, also from the host community. At the local level, this also gives local people and migrants and refugees an opportunity to get to know each other through the volunteering, through the activities that they do together. And this can, again, strengthen social inclusion and cohesion. And it can counter negative stereotypes and prejudices because people get an opportunity to talk to each other and get a better understanding of where each other are coming from, each other's backgrounds, traditions, and customs, and so on. At the national level, in addition to adding to better integration, it is also volunteering has also shown to fulfill many different. There are many different activities that the state might not necessarily be able to do on its own. So that's where volunteering comes in. In many places a substitute. So, for example, we have at the moment in the UK, we, for example, have a lot of food banks because the situation for many people is quite difficult at the moment. So a good example of how volunteering is helping out in the local community. I should say that this does also raise questions around the role of the state and what the role of the state should be, but that's beyond what we're focusing on here. Okay, so if you're looking at some of the barriers, again, many of them, there are many more mentioned in the actual papers. I'm just going to look at a few of them. Barriers, first of all, to volunteering at the individual level. Refugees and migrants might not have any previous experience in volunteering. They might not know what volunteering is all about. They might feel that they don't have the right skills, both in terms of languages and other skills that's required, or the right educational level. And that might mean that they are hesitant to volunteer. From an organizational point of view, organizations that need volunteers might not know anything about the local community, the local refugee and migrant community. They might not know what skills and experiences migrant and refugees could potentially bring to the organization, and hence they're not necessarily reaching out to them. At the systemic level, there's also a lack of awareness of the importance of integration volunteering for integration. So integration is not a part of many policies and practices. If we look at the barriers to migrant and refugee-led organizations engaging in public policy-making processes, again, there's more mentioned in the paper itself. I'll just go through a few of them. First of all, many of these organizations will lack knowledge about these processes, and they will lack knowledge about what is actually on the agenda of these policy processes. So what is it that is being discussed at the moment? And most importantly, also how they can get involved. Many policymakers also still view the engagement of migrant and refugee-led organizations more as an add-on, or as something that they feel they have to do in order to gain votes, or as something they have to do in order to tick boxes. So these organizations are not very well integrated into the public policymaking processes. There might also be some important power struggles going on. So some of the things that are important for migrants and refugees might, for example, never make the agenda. And there might be some differences between what's in the interest of migrants and refugees and what's in the interest of the majority. So there's some important power struggles that might hinder good engagement as well. Finally, it's also important to think about representation, because quite often when we talk about migrants and refugees, we talk about them as if they were just one group with one set of interests and one set of needs. Obviously, we all know that that's not the case. So we need to think about how we can ensure that there is representation of all refugees and migrants as well. And also especially where they intersect with other groups. So, for example, research has shown that a lot of these organizations are only focusing on the interest of one particular ethnic group, for example, or one particular religious group. So we need to make sure that we find ways of dealing with that as well. Looking at the barriers to compulsory education, many schools don't have enough funding at the moment to even look after the kids that's already in school, never mind having adequate funding to take in more kids, especially migrant and refugee children. Many refugees and migrant families also find it quite difficult to navigate the local school system. So they find it difficult to understand how you can apply for a school place, for example. There's also a lot of families that perhaps won't have a birth certificate for their child, which might make registration quite difficult. There's also problems around securing transportation. So especially while refugees and migrant children are perhaps still in a camp somewhere, the local school that they have been allocated to might be quite far away and might not be easy to get to. And finally, there's also some issues that children, especially migrant and refugee children in reception centers, will face, and the ones that don't have protective status. In some countries, there is not a legal right to provide them with continuous education either, so the education they get might be at a lower standard, and there might be gaps in it as well. So what is it that we can do? How can we make things better? I'd really like you to think about these general considerations, and these goes across all three areas. So first of all, we're focusing on the role and actions of policymakers and religious organizations, congregations, and leaders. And we're really trying to think about what it is that these actors can do in these three different areas. So how can they help improve these three different areas? I'd also like you to focus on to think about what are the kind of main challenges that will be for this kind of involvement, and how can interreligious and intercultural dialogue help. And it would be particularly helpful if you could come up with some examples of cases where this has been done successfully. So if you have any knowledge about any local projects or any local actions that's been taken, we'd be really interested to hear about that. Finally, in terms of general considerations, it's also important to think about what can be done at the different levels and what should be done at the different levels, which levels are most relevant. So again, within all three areas, where is it that action needs to be taken? Is it at the local, the regional, the national, or perhaps even the international level? Okay, so looking quickly at some of the potential recommendations, and I do want to emphasize that these are potential recommendations that I want you to discuss. Again, there is many more mentioned in the paper, so I'm just going to go through one for each of the different actors. So in terms of volunteering, policymakers could focus more on inclusivity and representation, so they could include migrants and refugees in the policymaking processes that are to do with volunteering. and perhaps they could use intercultural and interreligious dialogue to explore some of the similarities and differences in opinions and experiences. Religious leaders, organizations, and congregations can encourage and support volunteering, so they can again use intercultural and interreligious dialogue to encourage migrants and refugees to volunteer in their local community. So they can, for example, share their own positive experiences of volunteering, and they can also perhaps connect local migrants and refugees with organizations in their local community that need volunteers. In terms of engagement in policymaking processes, policymakers could be a lot better at sharing information. So in really trying to improve in sharing information with migrant and refugee-led organizations, again, about what it is that is being discussed at the moment, how can they be better engaged in these processes. Religious actors can do many different things. One of them is that they can advocate on behalf of migrant and refugee-led organizations for their meaningful, consistent, and impactful inclusion in relevant public policy-making processes, and perhaps they can especially do that in public policy processes that they are themselves engaged in as well. And in terms of formal education, policymakers can really try to make sure that they develop and implement policies that really oblige students to look at each individual migrant and refugees and make sure that they find the best school for that particular child. Also make sure that that the schools have enough allocated resources and support, so that there are no gaps in education, basically. And there's an interesting example from Sweden in the input paper that you can have a read about. In terms of religious actors, they can really provide guidance and support. So they can provide some support to migrant and refugee families. They can help them, for example, understand the local school system. They can help them write the application form, and they can perhaps also help them make sure that there is public transportation or that there's some other kind of transportation for the child so that they can go to school. Thank you very much.
Good to feel the sense that we are still somewhere there in the room. But thank you so much, Majbritt, for offering so many interesting insights and food for thought for our further discussion. I think what we see from the presentation is that there are still a number of barriers persisting on the way of inclusion, even though we have known about them for some time already, but the existing interventions do not seem to work. And we see also that one of the possible explanations could be is that most of these interventions are quite isolated and fragmented, or maybe short-term responses without longer-term vision, and that we see that the cooperation across levels, both vertically and horizontally, is key. And every stakeholder and actor, from policymakers to grassroots actors, has a very important role to play in the ensuring this inclusion. But not everyone yet has the capacity or opportunities or space to do that. I want to remind the participants that you are welcome to submit your questions in the chat while we have presentations and inputs from our speakers. And in the meantime, I would like to give the floor to our second presenter, Ms. Olivia Quinn, to talk about the educational interventions to counter hate speech. Please welcome Olivia.
Thank you. So I wanted to give a little bit of context before I went into this as to why KAICIID invited me to present this today and what we're looking to engage all of you with in this topic. So essentially, this is a little bit different than some of the other interventions that we spoke about and a lot of the things that we engage with in the migrant and refugee space. Because what we're looking at here with countering hate speech, especially towards migrant refugees, is very much focused on our host communities. It's not about the services that we're providing to refugees and to migrants and how we can foster their experience, but very much how we need to look inward into our own host communities around what are the drivers of hate. Why are these hate speech instances happening? What are the elements that are causing them in different contexts across Europe? So we commissioned this research really as a starting point. And the next step will be engaging you in understanding how you can add to this. But the starting point is very much around what are the types of education programs that are in place, who's offering them, and who are they targeted at. So as we went into this research, we focused predominantly on FBOs, just to limit the space with a few select civil society entities. We looked at the policy landscape, we looked a little bit at state-led interventions, but really we wanted to see what are faith-based communities doing and what is the space they should and can own around countering hate speech. And we did aim to have a scope across most of Europe. We weren't able to include everywhere and every type of program. But what we really saw is that there was a trend in the types of programs that were being offered were very much around fostering positive messaging, around showing how migrants and refugees can potentially add value to our societies. They can add to our economies. They can bring diversity, around fostering dialogue. A lot about asking refugees to have encounters with people in host communities to explain who they are, what their stories are, why they're there. And while this is absolutely an essential part of this kind of education, what we really found the gap to be was in the part around what our role is. That it's not about refugees or migrants being positive. It's not just that they have to add value to our societies, but what has been in the European context? Why are there drivers of hate? What's pushing them? This is absolutely not in any way or shape new. We can position around the 2015 perceived refugee crisis, but there's been cycles of hate. There's been elements in the education system. So what we were really trying to look at is what are these approaches that we can use, which ones are working, where there's challenges, where there's gaps, and also, though, not just what's happening, but who should we be targeting? Because very generalized anti-hate speech campaigns, certainly they add value, certainly they're nice to have, but are we targeting the people who are the ones actually conducting the hate speech? Or are we mostly preaching to the converted, right? People who are more likely to be sympathetic to refugees and migrants, people who are maybe slightly undereducated and are holding some negative stereotypes, but who are what we were calling the movable middle. So what we were really looking at here is, has there been enough work around looking at the types of programs we're running and who we're targeting at them? So in very simple terms, a positive messaging campaign at a white supremacist group, we understand has very, very little value, right? And secondly, when we looked at the majority of the faith-based organizations as part of this research, there was a really significant gap in looking at the biggest perpetrators of hate speech. There was very little focus on white supremacist groups, on anti-migration groups, on active and established groups conducting this hate speech we're trying to target. And I think what was particularly striking, and also what our participants shared, was many of these people are part of the very same congregations and faith-based groups that are doing this countering hate speech work. If we look at the statistics in many of the countries, by default, the people who are at the forefront of hate speech are often part of a religious congregation, part of the church, part of a faith-based group. So really what we want to do here is say, what are the structures that we can put in place to make countering hate speech towards migrants and refugees easier to implement, that we're better at sharing resources, that each one of you in the room can leverage off what the other people have learned. That's essential, but it's very functional and operational. Those tools, many people mentioned in the earlier session some of the work they were doing, but in my research and in the interactions I had, I wasn't able to find those tools or those evaluations. So if we can have a way of condensing them, and that's something that is fundamental to get everyone involved in. Secondly, how can we get the data, have the evidence, and look at what are the drivers of hate speech? Obviously, they're not going to be the same in every cultural context, in every country, in every socioeconomic level. But what's at the root? Why is it appearing in certain places? Who are the main audiences who are really propelling hate speech? And what kind of programming is most effective for them? That doesn't mean we shouldn't have all the programs that we have in place. But if we're trying to look at prevention, if we're trying to look at interventions, and maybe in some places we're just trying to condemn hate speech, how are we matching those programs to the people and the audiences? And this isn't so much about the refugees and migrants. Absolutely, they can share with us their experiences, how it impacts them, be a stakeholder in the discussions, but this is about what is happening in host societies that hate speech is a problem? Why do we need to target it? When we have an influx of migrants in 2015 onwards, why is it a problem for us as societies? And I think that's what this research is aiming to look at. That can be looking back at structural racism in education. It can be looking at maybe we need to do more acknowledging of the colonial impact. And even today, a lot of people have mentioned Afghanistan. Who were the forces that were there? Who sold those weapons, right? Migration isn't just a favor that we're doing to let people in. We need to look at the historical context as well and how that's better built into our education. So I think off the back of this, we're really seeing this research as a starting point. We're trying to map what's happening, the challenges that exist, where it's working. But what we want to understand is who's doing this work that we haven't covered. How can we add more examples, more practices, more knowledge sharing that isn't immediately accessible? What is the thinking around how we target our programs better? And I think also, how do we look more honestly at the drivers of hate and say this is a host community challenge that needs to be addressed? So I think this is a huge part of what we want from the people in this room and as we go forward. Thank you.
Raised a number of important questions which might be quite difficult to answer, but hopefully we would also try to cover some of those during the follow-up discussion, and we understand that kind of trying to target the symptoms of hate speech is not really helpful or will not yield any results. We need to address the roots of hatred and be careful, quite clear and also mindful about the approaches that we use, and we need a very thorough understanding of what works for whom and in which context, and for that it's important to bring all the different evidence and information that comes from all the three dimensions of this research, policy and practice nexus for us to understand how we can come up with those comprehensive and holistic approaches. But I hope that later on in the discussion we would also be able to hear maybe a bit more examples of some of the initiatives that you already mapped, or what we also can hear from the participants in the audience and from our commentators. So now I would like to invite some inputs from our 5 commentators to offer the initial reflections on the findings that we've heard from Majbritt and on the questions that were raised by Olivia. And then we will move to the general discussion and welcome the questions from all the audience. So I would like now to give floor to Ms. Rachel Bayani, a representative of Brussels Bahai community, and to give a reflection or input on specifically on the increase and strengthening refugee and migrant participation in volunteering in their local communities. Please, Rachel.
Thank you so much, and I'm looking very enviously at the room and wish I could be there. But just to say that really the theme of volunteering and reading also the concept paper, it's actually a very beautiful theme, and every human being longs for meaning, and the most sophisticated form of meaning in life is often found in service to others and to our surroundings. So thinking about this question of volunteering is very powerful. Just maybe a few comments more at the level of sort of assumptions, postures, and attitudes. And generally, I think also volunteering is not something that local populations naturally do, and that those who newly arrive now need to learn to do. It is a capacity that we all need to acquire, and that needs to be nurtured much more in European society, whether it is through our school systems or elsewhere. So building that capacity more generally in our societies, understanding how to awaken the desire to be of service to others in everyone, is something that needs to be learned about. And then that learning will then also provide a deeper understanding as to how to go about it when it comes to those who newly arrive. So I feel that it's important not to sort of introduce certain dichotomies. then often those who newly arrive come from societies where the sense of community is quite advanced and where the concept of service is already a natural cultural or even religious feature of what one does on a daily basis. So it might not be called volunteering in that way, and it might take a different shape, for instance, in the form of women of a community looking after each other's children, providing for other community members when the need arises. And that's just one example. But these forms of volunteering are already natural and inbuilt reflexes present in those communities. So how do we allow for those reflexes to also find expression here? And so this means that we have to be very careful not to impose a certain concept of volunteering, but to be very open to various forms of volunteering. So then this relates to the notion of integration, because that notion sort of assumes that you're taking something from outside and trying to make it fit into something existing. But we also know that we have a lot to learn from those who just arrive. And in the particular context of volunteering, we can refine our own understanding, or the understanding that's prevalent here in Europe, by drawing on really the vast experiences of service that are prevalent in other communities. So how do we reconceptualize things as a joint learning process where residing populations learn jointly with newly arrived populations about, for instance, this notion of volunteering? And then this brings me to the whole idea of sort of this legal and financial barriers to volunteering. So, and of course they exist, but the fact that we're speaking about these barriers means that we have a certain idea of what volunteering might be, and it's an idea that might be to some extent rigid. So you need to go to a place and someone tells you exactly what it is you need to be doing. So, but again, we know that there's many forms of service. And so maybe the presence of such barriers just requires revisiting whether a volunteer opportunity or project is serving its purpose, or if it has become too complex and rigid. Is it, for instance, embracing universal participation? How can sort of volunteering opportunities be offered in such a way that these barriers are not there? If volunteering possibilities are built from the grassroots up with the full participation from those who newly arrive, then they will also look different. So then another thing is, how do we learn to tap into the religious background also of many of those populations who are arriving newly, because this is the language they speak. So how do we also sort of create that desire through that religious language? All religions have that concept present in religious writing. So how do we really tap into that? And just to conclude, now all of this relates to how we view and conceptualize those who newly arrive. If we view them as individuals of capacity, filled with potential, and that we can learn from, the way we will go about thinking about some of these questions is very different than if we view them as sort of merely people who need help and need to be assisted to learn something. So in brief, even though there are of course certain circumstances, this is not to be naive or romanticize anything, that need to be taken into account, how can we overcome also this insider-outsider dichotomy and really see all of us on a path of learning of how to contribute to the betterment of our societies?
Thank you, Rachel, for offering this reflection and quite different perspective on how we approach engagement into volunteering. And I completely agree that somehow in our dialogue or discussions, we usually perceive our target groups as victims and those that need support, with somehow forgetting about them being also quite capable agents of change who just need to be empowered and given the opportunity and space to actually implement this change together with the whole community. But this also brings me back to the questions that Majbritt already raised in her presentation. So like still thinking about these systemic barriers that are present or kind of that is shaping our thinking in a way of engaging different grassroots actors into policy processes or building civil society. We need to think about the kind of separate and also common roles of each of those actors so that we strengthen and build all the efforts, create the synergy with all the efforts rather than promoting this isolated and fragmented response or hoping that just one particular actor would make a difference. Thank you so much, and I would like to pass the floor to our second commentator, Ms. Laura Batalla-Adam, policy advisor from Ashoka Hello Europe, to speak and offer more reflections on engagement in the policy-making processes.
Thank you very much, Hanna, and thank you to KAICIID as well for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with all of you in beautiful Lisbon after having attended to the two previous policy forums. I would just like to start by giving a very short introduction about Hello Europe. I mean, Hello Europe is an initiative by Ashoka, which is the largest NGO bringing together social entrepreneurs around the world. It was this initiative, Hello Europe, was established during the so-called migration crisis in 2015 to identify the leading social innovations in the field of migration and integration. And since then, we have been gathering them in our portfolio and trying to connect those solutions to policy making in order to design policies that would respond to the needs of refugees and migrants. I read the input papers, and I would like to congratulate the presenters and the authors of those papers. I think they provide a very valuable input and basis for our discussions in the coming 2 days, but I would like to also start with some reflections and end with some recommendations, particularly in the field of how to bring refugees and migrants more integrated into policy making. I think one of the biggest challenges, and this is where we have been working and focusing a lot within Hello Europe, is the narrative around migrants and refugees. We have been seeing how the perception of migrants and refugees has been very polarized around two specific ways of portraying them, one of them being as a threat, as being a problem for our societies, and how politics and politicians have been instrumentalizing this for their political agendas and all the anti-migration rhetoric that we have been observing, particularly in Europe, in the past 5 years. But there is as well another perception about refugees and migrants, which is equally harmful, and for us is the most important one, which is the view of migrants and refugees as objects of pity and compassion who need saving. And this one is the most disempowering one. And this is what we have been trying to offset this narrative, because it fails to recognize leaders from migrant and minority backgrounds who are indeed creating change. And it was mentioned in the paper, and I think this is a very important realization. They are mostly agents of change, and this is at the moment not being recognized enough. So we have been trying to construct this new narrative around migration so that depicts migrants and refugees as active change makers contributing to society. And instead of advocating on behalf of them, what we have been trying to do is to provide them with a platform where they can share their stories with their own voice and place them at the center of the conversation from which they have been long excluded. We started with a pilot project in Spain, identifying what we call change makers for migration a couple of years ago, and we have now identified over 50 leaders around Europe who are active agents of social change with a personal connection to migration, either because they have personally migrated, or they come, or they are part of a family who has migrated in recent generations. And they are all leading either small or large-scale social initiatives that try to somehow contribute to improve the life of other migrants. We've seen that the problem basically around narrative is also that these stories do not have enough visibility. So, and the fact that, for instance, all the initiatives that we are seeing, or many initiatives in the social sector, are failing to solve these societal challenges effectively because they do not tackle the root causes of the problems, but instead they just treat the visible problems. So working with these change makers, we realized that they are the best place to develop an ability to recognize multiple deep-rooted causes underlying the problems of migration and integration. And they are the best place because they actually have this intimate knowledge of the needs of their own community. So they should be the ones speaking on behalf of these communities because they know probably better than anyone else, and because they also emerge from these underrepresented communities. So we are currently seeing how the policy sector has begun slowly to acknowledge the need of these, what are also called proximate leaders, to achieve effective and sustainable solution to the problems, but it is not enough. I mean, in the paper, there were a couple of initiatives mentioned at the EU level, like this working group with, expert group on the views of migrants that is now advising directly the Commission when it comes to designing these policies. This is a very important step, and I believe around in the room there are a few of you who are part of this expert group. This has been a long-term demand of organizations like ours to really have a say in those policies. But what we advocate for especially is that migrants and refugees do not only need to be participants, but they need to be co-creators of these policies. So we believe that co-creating policy directly with policymakers and making policymaking more diverse and inclusive is one of the ways to respond to the needs and the contribution that migrants and refugees can make to society. There were some challenges that were mentioned in the paper that I was assigned to read, like, for instance, the difficulties that many migrants and refugees face when it comes to understanding and navigating policymaking, which especially at the EU level, I think it's quite cumbersome for many of them to understand how to navigate all these corridors. But it is important to remember as well that at the EU level, the EU does not hold full competence for all migration and especially integration and inclusion policies. So change has to as well come from other government levels, mainly the local one and the national one. And I believe during the presentation of Mrs. Pereira this morning, we heard very good examples of how at the local level these migration hubs, for instance, are working to respond to those needs, but also to empower those refugees. So we need to connect them more. We need to connect migrants and refugees more directly with the different stakeholder ecosystem of migration, not only policymakers, but other actors that, like here, are represented today, different organizations from different sectors. This needs to be a multi-stakeholder and multi-sectorial approach to deal with this issue. And also, lastly, but also very importantly, because of these negative perceptions around migration, is not only important to bring them closer to policymaking, but also to build bridges between EU citizens or citizens around the world and those newcomers. So these are, in a nutshell, a few recommendations, but of course there are a lot of obstacles that remain in the way still for them to be able to fully participate in co-designing these policies that would respond better to their needs and how to contribute to society. And funding is one of them, for instance, but also having this access to funding, but more importantly, and this is something that we're trying to work on, is capacity building. So providing them with the legal support, with the cultural immersion grants, and to actually untap this potential that they have in their communities to contribute to them. So I hope we can continue discussing these recommendations in the coming days, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Laura, for your input and for sharing this quite an inspiring pilot project on the platform for the given also voice and collaboration with the local actors for social change. And I completely agree with you that there are quite many initiatives happening on the ground which don't get enough visibility, and it's important to give that visibility, to create the platform, to share, to engage in dialogue, so that we also learn from the successes and failures of each other. And also thank you, special thanks for mentioning the importance of co-creation and co-designing, because we often talk about the engagement of any kind of stakeholders in policy making process, but particularly of migrant and refugee communities. And we usually stop at this level of consultation, or sometimes we talk about representation, but creating very formal structures where visibly they are represented, but eventually they don't really have any power to influence the decision-making process. And it's the question here, and I hope that we can also further discuss on how we can move to this more advanced level of engagement when we create partnerships, when we co-create and we co-decide together and co-design the policies together. And now I would like to move to the third commentator, Dr. Andrew Orton, to speak a bit more about access issues to quality education, and raise questions and comment on recommendations on how we can actually advance better in this area as well. Please, Andrew.
Thank you. And greetings to you all from Durham in the UK. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today. I've been asked to comment on the paper on ensuring access for migrant and refugee children to compulsory formal education in Europe. And what I'd like to do, I think, is first of all congratulate Majbritt and those who've got inputted into that paper. Some really important issues in there around physical access, funding, finding appropriate places to engage in education, ensuring quality teaching, and a whole range of other things that are worth reading further about. What I'd like to comment on is just to think a little bit more about the schools within their broader social context and the important role that schools play in enabling sort of wider integration for migrant and refugee children. I think there's things that could be sort of further developed in relation to this that many people in the room will have some experience of, particularly those involved in faith communities. So if we're thinking about schools as potentially places for integration or indeed of exclusion, we can think about for the children and their parents or carers as they approach the playground, what does it look like? What happens on the first day of attending? Do they feel welcome as part of a particular educational establishment? This is partly an issue about formal initiatives, but it's also about informally what happens, in those informal interactions between parents, between different pupils. So what happens in terms of whether schools have set a culture where everyone, including migrants and refugees, is welcome, not just in the formal teaching, but in some of those informal activities that are supported, what's on the walls, all of those types of things. What happens when migrants or refugee children experience bullying or discrimination, and are there effective systems for handling that so that people don't end up being continually excluded, even though there's a formal place there for them? Are there those forms of specialist language support that might help people to engage with that sort of majority language in that context and get the most out of the educational opportunities available to them? Do the teachers have the intercultural skills that they might need to try and include the pupils from different backgrounds in that context, to empathise and connect with some of the experiences they may have had as a result of their moving journey? What are the sorts of informal, beyond the curriculum, what are the informal activities, the clubs, the activities, the social side of school, which is really important in terms of whether we feel part of something and whether we feel that our diversity is recognised within that collective context. Is there peer mentoring? Are there other ways in which people are given some support to be included? And within all of this, particularly for a conference like this, we can think about how faith communities, such as my own or other faith communities in Europe, might play a role within this. Are they encouraging their members to informally welcome and support some of the interactions that might happen when they're participating, on the playground or taking part in schools? Are they volunteering to run some of these welcoming integrative activities that teachers may struggle to have the time to do outside of the formal curriculum? What's going on in terms of are they helping governing boards or of schools to understand some of the different beliefs and cultures that might be represented amongst the pupils that are attending? What sorts of, are they engaging in dialogue on some of those rules and being aware of some of the ways in which some of the rules that might be in place within particular educational establishments might be intentionally or unintentionally exclusive of particular pupils and what they feel comfortable to participate? Do they get involved in supporting those refugees and migrant children who have perhaps experienced prejudice or discrimination? And can they support them in seeking a just response to those experiences of inequality? We've got a very diverse policy landscape in Europe, but clearly in some contexts, faith communities are directly involved in running particular schools and educational establishments. So where that's the case, are they adapting their school practices to model some of those religious precepts and beliefs about welcoming the stranger and including those who are excluded? Finally, I think basically what I'd like to say in terms of public policy is just recognising that this sort of social role of school goes beyond that formal curriculum role. They're part of a broader network of public, voluntary, civic, social institutions, of which many are represented here today. But they're also part of this broader policy landscape that some of the other presenters have already recognised about things like families who don't have enough food and are having to rely on food banks, or pupils that have mental health needs, maybe as a result of traumatic journeys in the past, who are then needing some basic mental health support in order to be able to participate fully in education at all. So thinking about those public policy initiatives like universal breakfast clubs that mean children aren't going to school hungry in the morning, or making sure they have that access to that counselling support. And in all of this, as many of the presenters have already said, we've got to listen to those people with the first-hand experience of engaging in these ways of experiencing hopefully inclusion, but all too often exclusion, and then being able to adapt what we're doing in order to respond to those experiences and improve them for others. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for your input and for important reminder that learning takes place not only in schools, but all around schools as well, and the communities. And this is where it's important to create this safe learning environment, bringing together the formal education institutions, but also non-formal education actors and the communities. And this is where we also can connect the papers on our discussions that we are having now on the access to formal education, but also volunteering that we've been discussing before, which is also empowering and could potentially bring additional support in specific needs that some of migrant or refugee students may face. And also emphasizing the cross-sector collaboration, that when we talk about very complex needs and addressing those needs effectively, which comes not only to educational support, but also emotional health support, social support, and so on. And also, thank you for raising all these different questions about the role of faith-based organizations and also actual maybe capacity of faith organizations in different countries to offer support in overcoming the barriers that we talked about in access to formal education, but maybe also all the other areas. And so I would also invite the audience to think about these questions and maybe offer some reflections after we move to the discussion round. But before I move to the questions and commentators to comment specifically on the input paper 4, I would like to ask Majbritt if you maybe would like to offer some reflection or any response to what you have just heard now from the speakers who were commenting on your papers.
Thank you. And thank you so much. Yeah, a lot of that was really helpful. and quite diverse as well. I think one thing we do have to keep in mind is that there are massive differences in all these 3 areas across Europe. So, for example, when we were talking about volunteering, some countries have a lot of structures already, have a lot of organizations that's already involved in volunteering. I can talk from my perspective from Denmark, for example. I think I grew up with the idea that if you are a good citizen, you are also volunteering. It's part of the parcel, really. We have in most areas, about 50% of people volunteering. So we have to keep in mind that there are quite a lot of differences as well in terms of that. I also think I completely agree that we need to really think quite carefully about the language we use as well around it, and we need to think quite carefully about. I, for example, still sometimes struggle with the word empowerment, because I'm not really sure that we need to empower people more. It's listening to them more, really. It's involving them more. It's not about, because empowerment sort of implies that there's something wrong, that there's something, people have to be better at something. There's something wrong with people at what they have now. In most cases, it's more the case that we have to be a lot better at listening, at including. And I should say I'm a migrant myself, so I'm talking from personal experience with that as well. I think that's it for now, really. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Majbritt. And now I would like to move to Mr. Alexander Mundt from UNHCR to give reflections and comment on the interventions to help combat the hate speech. Thank you.
No, thank you. No, I was just reflecting on Laura's intervention where she looked around the room and said, I really want to be here with you all. I was having the same impulse looking at the screen and thinking, I wish I were on Zoom, because after 2 years of working in isolation and lockdown, it's quite daunting to be on a stage under strobe lights. It's a bit of baptism by fire, and I think Zoom has become my comfort zone, as it has been for many. But I'm really happy to be here. I think this is incredibly timely, the meeting, and I'm glad it's in person, because I think the downside of the Zoom calls is you don't get the interaction, you don't get to bounce around ideas and make connections and just talk to people in a more normal way. So I think it's fantastic. Just picking up on, before I get to the paper which I was asked to comment on, I would just like to pick up on a couple of comments and situations that were mentioned in this panel and earlier panels. One being Belarus and one being Afghanistan, because I really think we're seeing the mobilization of fear and hate in real time. And in Belarus, we see the instrumentalization of people for political ends. And there is no reason that this can't be handled in a humane, rights-based way. It's thousands of people in a block of countries that have a population of 450 million, and that have fairly robust and rigorous asylum systems. There is no reason this has to be handled this way. But I think the fact that it is, and the fact that it's mobilizing this level of fear and this level of anxiety and this level of sort of crisis narrative speaks to sort of the continuing hold that migration has on the policy debate in Europe. And I think, the response actually is playing into the hands of the person who's instrumentalizing these movements, because he knows that he can cause political chaos by, poking at a weak spot in the European sense of unity that shouldn't be there. The other situation clearly is Afghanistan, where we saw, in August, this outpouring of support and empathy and sympathy and offers to take people into their home. And then at the same time, we've seen this give way to, we don't want Afghans here. They need to stay in the region. They need to stay, this sort of perpetual othering that we've seen repeatedly. And what we're seeing now is a sense of, well, there's certain good refugees, those that we pick out who meet certain criteria, and then there's bad refugees who have to make, I think, the incredibly difficult and dangerous decision to seek protection outside of Afghanistan, cross borders into Iran, often with smugglers, often with huge personal risk, cross the border into Turkey, cross the border into Greece, evade authorities, evade pushbacks, but those are somehow bad refugees. Those ones aren't welcome here. So, and I think we have to ask ourselves why. And just turning to the paper, and there's been a bit of a discussion about drivers of hate and hate speech. And one of the elements that actually struck me in the paper, and it made mention to it, was the role of social media and the internet in perpetuating hate. And in this, the monster we've created with algorithms and artificial intelligence. And it struck me as I was preparing for today and tomorrow for this conference, that we've created something that amplifies hate and amplifies fear at such a level that we don't understand and we can't get our heads around. And one quote from one of my favorite social commentators, it's actually Jon Stewart. I don't know if anybody's seen him, but he's more of a comedian, but I find him one of the most astute social commentators, at least in the US, but I think some of what he says is quite global. But he said, we're adjusting to a new information and political ecosystem. The delivery system is more sophisticated, more robust, and more ubiquitous. It helps radicalize in a faster way or a deeper way. We have algorithms that make sure that if you are starting to lean towards something bad, then the algorithm says, I've got a 4-hour manifesto you've got to see. We have created a machine that makes that kind of radicalization more efficient. And I think we're seeing that play out in, I think, the mobilization of anti-migrant, anti-refugee sentiment across Europe. And these tools we've created that we don't understand how to mitigate, how to modify, are a big part of this factor. And so when we consider policy responses in education, how are we considering how children are accessing sources of information? Because many of them spend hours a day on Facebook, on Instagram, on various, and how can we make them better consumers of information? How can we help them recognize what's fake news from real? How can we help them realize that they're being manipulated by forces a lot of us don't even quite understand? And some of that is also how can you actually help them integrate the learned experience in the classroom with what they're hearing outside of the classroom, which makes up a huge part of their socialization in these societies. So just commenting on the paper, I think I didn't find much to disagree on. In Andrew's presentation, I found nothing to disagree with. Because a lot of what UNHCR has tried to do in the past 6 years since the 2015 wave of migration was actually to create an initiative, broad-based, called Teaching About Refugees that teachers could use in the classroom. And it was in response to the fact that, one, all of the headlines in 2015, 2016 were dominated by headlines of the refugee crisis, that wasn't really a crisis, but even just that in the media, the way it was portrayed reinforced this sense that this was an invasion by people who didn't share, our culture, our religions, our way of life. We created it out of that, I think, basic thinking that, one, we need to clarify what it means to be a refugee, and the second part of this was that refugees were in the classroom. Traumatized refugee students were part of the classroom. How do you build a sense of empathy and understanding among students in primary school, in secondary school, and university? Because school can be, as Andrew said, places of inclusion, but also places of inclusion, places of bullying, places where the edges become quite sharp. So how do you sort of create that sense of empathy in the classroom, and how do you also identify the signs of trauma of children who have undergone a fairly dramatic experience and need help, who may not have access to the same thing other students do, and how do you sort of create an understanding and an awareness of sort of who these people are, why they're different and why they're the same, and for those in need, how can you sort of channel them into assistance, often at community level. And I think this is where UNHCR has gradually, I would say, come to the recognition that faith groups have a huge role to play in leveraging their trust, their role in the community, their reliance on religious traditions of charity, of hospitality, of engagement, that are also sort of bedrock principles of the 1951 Convention, which is sort of the secular manifestation of a lot of that. But, you know, how can you mobilize communities around that? Which brings me to my other point, and this came out, I think, quite clearly in the paper. A lot of these initiatives, and we've heard this before, we don't know how to measure them, we don't know how to evaluate them, we don't know what impact they're having. We're making assumptions that, I mean, we've stopped calling things like this good practice, we call it promising practices now, because we don't know how to measure preventive action that prevents something from happening, or how to measure the impact of changing someone's mind or creating a more inclusive environment. So a lot of these programs, we simply don't have a way of evaluating or measuring. I think the other aspect of this that I would just mention here, where we're increasingly engaging on, is rumors, misinformation, stereotypes, which falls short of hate speech, but is incredibly damaging, incredibly dangerous for people. So we're also trying to, in countries all over Europe, create simple community-based fora, often through social media platforms, that actually bring in refugees to assess and counter rumors, misinformation, to push back on, there's a lot of smugglers now use the internet to attract people through false promises, but actually trying to involve refugees in separating out what's true from false, what's a rumor. And again, we're at the initial stages of this, but this is a little bit the direction we're going in. Let me wrap up there. I think I'm over time, and sorry this was a bit all over the place, but there was so much detail in the conference I couldn't quite keep my thoughts straight. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for, I think, very useful and very insightful reflections. And I think, and also raising so many important questions that I hope you will be able to discuss further in the working sessions, even if we don't manage to cover all the questions now in this session. And now I would like to give the floor to our last commentator, Professor Giancarlo Penza from the St. Egidio community, to offer another reflection on the same topic. Please.
Yes, thank you. I should have 5. Okay. Just let me thank you for the invitation. Let me just share with you some examples, suggestions, and good practices in order to face and to overcome the language of hatred and prejudices towards migrants. I will share with you 3 points. First point, religion. Just a few days ago, the 36th International Meeting of Men and Religions for Peace was held in Rome to spread the spirit of Assisi, which I know for sure you know what is it. 36 years of journey, along which the leaders of world religions met, talked, confronted each other to overcome hatred and opposition and rediscover at the bottom of their traditions the value of peace. But I was very impressed this year by their speeches and their behavior. Several decades ago, when they talked together, and when they met together for the first time, they were often self-referential. They did not relate to each other and to history. They were strangers to each other. I noticed instead that the long history of dialogue has increased the ability to talk to each other. and perhaps the contact with the evil of the pandemic has also affected them. The key word was together. Together. Today, the religious worlds have understood the need to be together in a global world, and defeating the language of hate within religions, it is absolutely very important. Always one next to the other, never again one against the other. Second point, politics. There is an enormous responsibility of politics in igniting hate speech and in feeding prejudice. Look at the diagram. The response of Italian public opinion to the statement, immigrants are a danger to public order and the safety of people, is ordered over time from 1999 until 2007 and 2017. It can be seen that the moments of the greatest alarm correspond to the phases of the electoral campaign, when the arguments of fear and safety are fed instrumentally. While the lowest point is recorded when a specific immigration ministry for immigration has established, which was entrusted, moreover, to one of the most esteemed and relevant independent personality on the Italian and European culture and religious scene, who did a lot to promote the integration of migrants, especially using appropriate and not conflictual language. The culture of the enemy and the propaganda of hatred are defeated with good laws and an efficient system of reception and integration, what is often lacking on the part of politics. The feeling of rejection on the part of the people is also due to the perception of chaos and insecurity determined by the way in which migrants arrive in the country of destination. Traffickers, illegal landings. It is said arrivals must be reduced or blocked to combat traffickers, but traffickers thrive only because EU member states do not offer refugees any alternative legal, such an annual stabilization of an entry quota. See in the diagram here how the annual quota established by the Italian government for the issue of residence permits for work reasons has dropped in recent years. Forget the colors. Look just at the columns. You see? Or, for example, another method could be the use of sponsorship, which is denied in many European countries. Third point, faith-based communities and civil society. The approach of religious community and civil society through the Humanitarian Corridors program is very different. Selection is made in countries of first refuge, such as Lebanon for Syrian refugees or Ethiopia for Eritrean and Somali refugees, based on the criteria of vulnerability and adaptability to a new life in the host country. The arrival takes place through a regular flight, just as the entry into the country is regular. The welcome and integration process, moreover, is entirely entrusted to civil society, associations, groups, private individuals, people who want to get involved in helping someone in need, It is not the institutions that integrate, but the community. It is within family, community, and local environments that, through good practices, prejudice and fear are overcome. Suffice it to say that in these years of program activity, humanitarian corridor programs, people's demand for hospitality has exceeded the supply of beneficiaries, although these are now very numerous. There has been a lot of talk in recent years about models of integration, assimilation, multiculturalism, and so on. But the winning model is certainly the adoption model, taking care, accompanying, possibly in a family environment. And the good reception is widespread reception, that is the widespread distribution of newcomers, giving space and value to local realities. Think about that in Italy, nobody knows that, even the two major cities, Rome and Milan, together add up to about 20% of all foreign presence, while in several other large European countries, the concentration in the capital and in the largest urban context reaches and often exceeds 50 and 60%. Let me end with an example. An old woman whose name is Anna Pagliaro, 75 years old, lives in Calabria, which is one of the poorest regions of Italy. She has chosen to become a sponsor for refugees who arrive in Italy with the humanitarian corridors. She says, "I want to do my part to say no to war, which, as I see it, it is much more aimed at power and economic interests than the defense of human beings. Little by little, I realized that it wasn't just me sponsoring the family, but the whole community around me." And I think that this is a winning, or as I say, a win-win model for us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Penza, for this inspirational closing, and also for reminding that every coin has two sides. Our discussion was so fruitful that we gradually ran out of time. But before we proceed to closing, I would like to give a floor to and a chance to Olivia. Maybe if you have some reactions or reflections to the points shared by Alexander or Professor Penza or some other commentators.
Thank you. I think it was helpful to hear what people are doing on the ground, the UNHCR perspective, and Italy in particular, because unfortunately our research did not focus on Italy as much as we would like it to. I think it's very important to look at the social inclusion, to look at the roles different societies and different entities can play. But I think we still lack some of the, how are we going to get to the harder to reach areas, the socioeconomics, why the hate speech is there. There's certainly many people in many contexts who are willing and hopefully willing to adopt, to add people in, to understand what refugees have gone through in their journey. But I think what this research is pointing to is that's a stepping stone, but that will not be the lever to really target hate speech. It will just probably make certain parts of it smoother or re-educate certain parts of the population. So I think it's very helpful to have that perspective. Thank you.
I would like, yes, to thank everyone, and also for the participants who could probably come up with different questions, and we also received some questions in the chat, but we don't have time to discuss them now in the plenary, but we will have a lot of space to do it in the working sessions, because we will continue discussing those topics, and the questions raised now during the plenary I think will be very helpful to guide and direct those more in-depth discussion. And for the closing, I would just like to give floor to every speaker just to share some final remarks, very short, up to 30 seconds. If there are any few words or a question you would like all the audience to leave with for lunch, and then to continue the discussions later after lunch. Please, maybe we can start with Majbritt.
Thank you. I think I would just really like to say that I would love to hear more about what's happening in local communities around Europe. So if you have any stories you want to share, please do so, both in the plenary, but also feel free to email me. I hope KAICIID can pass on my email address. So if you have anything that you think could be helpful, please send on the information. That would be really much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Majbritt. Maybe we can proceed to Rachel.
Yes, thank you. Nothing in particular to add, but just to say that this really requires so many conversations at all levels. And how do we open spaces that allow for that joint thinking, for those joint conversations, whether it's from the grassroots to the policy level. And I think so that's something very important to try and sort of think about how do you create more and more of that? So really to sort of come to a certain unity of vision as to how to go about these things.
Thank you, Ms. Rachel. Can I give the floor to Ms. Laura?
Yes, I think reflecting on something that was said in the panel, I think that what we should be looking into in the next coming days would be how to turn these possible / good practices into systemic change. So I look forward to continuing this discussion with all the participants. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Andrew Orton.
I think for me, it's a clear message that we need to connect some of these different dimensions of actions that we're taking, not just to evaluate particular initiatives in isolation from each other, but to really think about the sort of broader social context in which we're operating, some of the political and economic dimensions, and also to think just about how we work together across these dimensions to achieve effective action.
Thank you so much. And we can now proceed to Ms. Olivia Quinn.
I think I shared the last little bit, but I think the last piece is just agreeing with what so many of the other people have said here today, that it requires state-led, it requires the role of faith-based communities, civil society, and how there can be a more cohesive and collective approach to looking at some of these areas.
Thank you so much. And we also have Mr. Alexander.
It's horrible to go last when everybody's made all the good points. No, I think I would just build on that. I mean, I think the challenge we have is there's good practice everywhere in the field, and there's so many positive examples, but how do you transform that into a policy agenda that has real teeth and that has the weight of your communities and popular will behind it at different levels, and what sorts of changes, how do we sequence the change we want to see that will really tackle some of these cycles of just irrational fear and hate that keep cropping up. Thanks.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Penza.
But let me just add, because I just finished to speak 2 minutes ago, so just let me add one consideration about what I heard today. We spoke about diversity in many aspects, but I think that today we are all together seeing how human globalization is making the world better. And I think that this is a very important, because it's a way to unify the world around human perspective and not only economical perspective. So diversity, but also unity in a human globalization. And this, I think, would be very important in order to afford the problems of the people who are moving migrants and refugees. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Penza. And I think this very well reiterates was one of the questions that was raised in the chat that it would be also good to raise this demographic and economic rationale to explain why we need refugee and migrant communities, and this would also help maybe reduce some of the negative consequences of hate speech. But reiterating what Professor Penza said, that we should always be reminded that human rights approach and this humanitarian human perspective is still should be in the driving seat. And I would like to thank all the speakers and all the commentators and presenters for such an engaging, inspiring inputs and reflections. And I hope that we created the base for future discussions in the working sessions. And I would like to close this session. Thank you very much all.
Yeah, thank you once again to the presenters of the input papers, to the distinguished speakers, and the moderator of this plenary session. And thank you as well to all of you here in presence or online who shared questions in the chat box. Please know that these questions are going to be tackled in the working sessions. I would like right now to announce that our lunch break is taking place on the same floor here in Eduardo's 7th room. Anyone taking halal or kosher options, you will find them clearly marked. We will continue after the lunch break at 2:30 p.m. directly with the first working session. Don't forget to check in which room your chosen working session is taking place. Rooms have a screen outside showing the name of the track, so make sure you're in the good room. In the app, you can see which track you have signed up for and read the input paper in case you didn't have time to do that before this session. Once you have entered one of the 4 tracks, you will follow the same one until tomorrow. Each track will be supported by facilitators and co-facilitators who will do a great job in making sure the working sessions are interactive, participatory, and dialogical. During these sessions, you will have the chance to come up with policy recommendations and further develop the input papers which have been presented. The final list of recommendations will be presented tomorrow in our closing plenary. And now, enjoy the lunch, and please join as well the Human Library session, which is happening after the working session here in the plenary at 4:30 p.m. So the whole group will reconvene here at 4:30 p.m. after the lunch and after the working session. Thank you so much, and enjoy the break.
The city.